So, let's talk about Lupin. Lupin III is one of the most influential and successful properties to ever come out of Japan, and if this video's existence doesn't make it obvious, it also happens to be a franchise I absolutely adore. The series dates back as early as 1967, and some of my fondest adolescent memories involve me staying up late into the night watching it alongside dozens of other anime. And although as I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more critical of a lot of the stuff I used to watch during this time, Lupin was, and still is, a series very near and dear to me. In fact, upon reflection and rewatching it, I can safely say it's one of the few franchises that I think has actually gotten better as I've gotten older. So I figured it might be fun to sit down and talk about it for a bit. Partially because I'm a dork with too much free time, but also because for as popular and influential as Lupin is, it's also a series that's surprisingly under the radar for a lot of people. Despite being almost 50 years old and one of the biggest brands in Japan, Lupin's still very much a niche show. For all its movies or TV shows, there's still a lot of people out here, especially in the West, who've never even seen or heard of it. And to me, that honestly sounds like a shame. So I figured, what the hell. I've got a microphone and some time to kill. So if I can convince some people to give the series a shot by rambling for a bit, then I might as well, right? So, without further delay, let's dive right in and talk about the absurd fun of Lupin III. Lupin III focuses on the story of the Lupin crime family, a gang of 3, sorta 4 super criminals as they go about their days stealing priceless objects, facing off other criminals, and dealing with whatever other shenanigans they can get themselves into from episode to episode. Your standard Lupin plot will generally feature Lupin wanting to steal some kind of precious item from someone, and the story of the episode would then focus on the twists and turns that follow, with Lupin often getting roped into increasingly complicated situations or forced to deal with insane security measures or even other criminals in order to get what he wants. And this is the core conceit behind Lupin. It's a series about characters committing crimes, and the crimes and motives may vary, but more often than not, this is what's always going to happen in your typical Lupin adventure. Though, if you hear that and think that it honestly makes the series sound kind of simple and broad, well, you'd be right, but you'd also be underestimating it. A big part of the appeal of Lupin is in how accessible and simple its core premise really is. If you're out to try and find some deep and complicated narrative, then Lupin really isn't going to do you any favors there. The series has its more poignant episodes to be sure, but the real point of it is for you to tune in and follow a small cast of likable characters for whatever adventures they get into from one episode to the next. Less an ongoing crime drama and more a crime-based sitcom, if you catch my drift. So while there might be a bit of an ongoing story here or there, for the most part every episode or movie or TV special is its own self-contained narrative. Most episodes really do boil down to something as simple as Lupin wanting to steal a certain item, or encountering one of the franchise's many hilariously exaggerated villains, and just watching how things play out from there. Which makes the series instantly accessible and also means that it has a set formula that could be allowed for a potentially infinite number of stories. Depending on whatever episode of Lupin you're watching, it could be anything from a fun heist story to a gritty detective noir to even a surreal dive into the supernatural to whatever the hell this is. And it's that variety that has kept the series as interesting and engaging as it has been. While the franchise definitely focuses on crime stories first and foremost, it has also never been afraid to dive headfirst into whatever storytelling it wants, and the results include some of the most memorable and, frankly, bizarre stories in all of anime. What I'm trying to get across here is that Lupin is absurd. Very, very, very absurd. But in spite of that, or hell, maybe even because of it, the series manages to tell some pretty powerful stories once in a while. One episode might be something as goofy as Lupin and the gang fighting a bulletproof magician. The next might feature a thrilling heist to steal a priceless treasure. And then the third could be the heart-wrenching story of one of the show's many one-off characters. And the crazy thing is, for as different as these 3 ideas all are, they work. The world of Lupin is a very strange one. A place where logic is limited only by one's imagination, where the laws of physics can be ignored on a whim, and where very grounded, human stories consistently play out in a theater of the absurd. It's a world of thrilling, bombastic crime dramas, but also deeply personal, emotional tragedies, with very flawed, sympathetic people. What sort of story you get ultimately depends on whatever episode you happen to be watching, but at its heart, Lupin can best be thought of like this sort of bizarre combination of James Bond, Ocean's 11, and Looney Tunes. But for as disjointed as that all may sound, it manages to come together into something not just captivating, but honestly pretty damn fantastic. The broadness of the brand means that the people behind the series can tell virtually any story they want, and that creative freedom at the very least guarantees that Lupin can't help but always be interesting. Episodes can just as easily show us the silliest, most nonsensical plots, as well as the deepest, darkest recesses of all these characters. Though, what ultimately keeps it all grounded and coherent is the Lupin gang itself. Episodic television lives and dies by its characters, and this also happens to be luckily one of Lupin's greatest strengths. Setting aside any of its hundreds of one-off side characters, Lupin at its core is a story about 5 people. The fun-loving, free-spirited Lupin, the curmudgeon sharpshooter Jigen, the stoic, old-fashioned Goemon, the highly alluring and manipulative Fujiko, or even Inspector Zenigata, who's hellbent on sending Lupin to jail. The characters are all distinct and simple enough that you can get what they're about after just a couple minutes, but the writing is consistently nuanced enough that they also feel like fully realized characters. The sort of characters who, in the hands of a talented team of writers, you can get endless enjoyment out of, and this, perhaps more than anything else, is something Lupin excels at. No matter how many riffs of it I see, it never gets old watching Jigen complain about whatever nonsense Lupin's gotten them into, or the ludicrous length that Zenigata is willing to go to imprison Lupin, or one of the many hilarious times that Goemon's staunch, old-fashioned worldview puts him at odds with the modern world. By all accounts, it's a routine that should have gotten old a long time ago, but to date the writers are still finding new and fun ways to make these characters bounce off one another. And part of the fun of Lupin is seeing the many layers of these characters as they get developed and fleshed out over time. What first began as some honestly pretty basic archetypes from the 60s have since developed into totally believable, nuanced people. We get to see them in their naive early days, we get to see them start to cope with being old, we see points in their lives when they're questioning what their professions are or what those professions even say about them. And we even get to see the very nature of these relationships change and develop in slight, if not meaningful ways. They're still of course the same people from way back when, but like any good show, the more it goes on, the more you get to know everyone. Until eventually it starts to feel like you're not just some person watching a show, but a full-on member of the gang, hanging out with a bunch of old friends. To the point that one of my all-time favorite episodes of Lupin is one where it's literally just the gang hanging out, going on a road trip and making small talk. So while you may be at first drawn to Lupin for its spectacle, it's these sort of nuanced character moments that end up making a lot of people stay. Pretty much everyone in the show is stupidly charming and fun in that sort of anti-hero Robin Hood sort of way. Lupin may be a world-class supercriminal, but he's not really a bad guy. Most episodes pit him against villains who are insanely, cartoonishly evil, and anyone he kills is almost always in self-defense. So while he may be a criminal and definitely not a good guy by any stretch, he's not a bad one either. In fact, he's honestly a pretty charming guy when you get to know him. He does what he does not to hurt anyone or to do anything bad, but just for the thrill and the adventure that comes with being a master thief. Which, granted, may put him on the wrong side of the law, but it also makes Lupin a lot more likable and keeps him more like an anti-hero as opposed to a villain. And every other main character in Lupin has similar redeeming qualities like this that help to make the cast of the show one of the most endearing out there. Don't get me wrong, Lupin can definitely be a creep at times, and some stories push the darker nature of these characters more than others. But at the end of the day, watching Lupin and his friends is just fun. That's what it really boils down to more than anything else. The characters are fun, the writing is fun, the music is incredibly fun, and oh my god, the animation in this series. Obviously some parts of Lupin are better animated than others. I mean, over the course of 50 years that's kind of a given. But generally speaking, the franchise has always been well animated and stylized, with many of the characters and set pieces given a unique aesthetic that can only really be described as distinctly Lupin. Plus, Over the years, dozens of talents in the industry have worked on the franchise, and as a result, the series' core style has almost constantly been evolving, with the simpler, softer early days now having evolved into the richly detailed and vibrant stuff we see today. And I cannot emphasize enough how downright gorgeous modern Lupin is, with Part 5 being the latest and best looking Lupin yet. Though even the older stuff still holds up shockingly well considering most of it is almost twice as old as I am, and you still get some pretty great animation bits throughout. All of it set to the franchise's iconic score, giving even the most basic scenes a flair that many other shows could only ever really dream of. Of course, I'm sure some of you are out there listening to all this and wondering, okay, what's the catch? If the show is well written, with great characters and action and animation and music, is the series just perfect? And as much as I would like to say otherwise, no. Lupin is absolutely not perfect and not for everyone. While I think the core formula still works and holds up remarkably well, it is still a formula, and that repetition might turn off some people. For modern Lupin, this isn't as much of an issue, but it can make trying to watch the older shows pretty rough. Especially if you catch the occasional episode where the writing doesn't quite work, or the characters don't flow as well as they normally do. There's not a lot of Lupin I would call outright bad, but when you have decades worth of material for anything, there's going to be some misses. Moments where the story isn't nearly as witty as it thinks it is, or where the series or its characters fall into annoying or even problematic territory, such as the fair amount of exploitative sexual content here or there. Part of it's just a product of the time and the country it was made in, and others just the result of questionable writing choices. Plus, while the series looks beautiful most of the time, there are times when someone's take on the Lupin art direction just doesn't work for whatever reason. Part 3's disastrous reimagining of Goemon comes to mind. But when all's said and done, those issues are honestly only mild annoyances on top of what's a pretty great franchise with a surprisingly consistent level of quality throughout it. Believe me when I say I could sit here and wax poetic about the series all day. I could list out my favorite episodes and rant in depth about them. I could talk about how the series' soundtrack is probably one of the most energetic and catchy things I've ever heard, or how excellent a number of the side characters really can be. But at the end of the day, like I said, Lupin is just fun. It's the perfect series to tune into once in a while and unwind without needing to think too hard and just enjoy the surreal spectacle on screen. And unlike a lot of other episodic shows, it also never overstays its welcome. Probably one of the biggest blessings and curses of episodic television is the fact that a lot of these sort of shows tend to go on until they've gotten stale, which is great because it means you generally get a lot of good seasons out of something, but it also means that by the end the show has been run into the ground. Yet, that's never been the case with Lupin. Despite the fact that the series is almost 50 years old and has been consistently coming out, when you actually break it down, there's nowhere near as much content as you'd guess. When all's said and done, there's been maybe around 300 episodes across the different shows, a couple dozen TV specials, and a handful of movies, and that sort of restraint has made sure Lupin never overstays its welcome. It'd be easy to just make a weekly show that you just tune into whenever you want and don't think twice about. But because Lupin comes and goes, it makes the time the show's around all the more meaningful. I remember reacting with absolute glee when I found out that Part 4 was finally coming out after almost 2 decades, and being blown away when Part 5 released just a couple years after that. And that wouldn't have been the case if Lupin never left. It doesn't matter how well written and likable any show is. Eventually the joke will get old and people will just move on. But by choosing quality over quantity, Lupin has managed to stay refreshing and enjoyable even after all these years. And the big gaps between proper installments in the show has allowed the series to adapt and evolve with the times in a way other episodic shows simply can't. Take for example another episodic anime that I have a soft spot for, Detective Conan. It's a pretty straightforward murder mystery series, and I got into it around the same time I got into Lupin. But for as much as I enjoyed it, every week was just the same story on a different day. A different murder mystery to solve and a different criminal to stop, and to be honest, I just got tired of it after a while. That's not meant to be a criticism, mind you. Like I said, I still generally like Detective Conan, even if I haven't watched it in years now, and I would still recommend it, but compared to Lupin, it's like night and day. Conan is the same show it was as the day it started, but Lupin has regularly changed and updated itself while still maintaining the same core framework. At the time of writing, there have been what you might consider 4 different eras of Lupin, split across 5 shows. And what marks each of these different eras are 2 things. A brand new Lupin anime series with a new direction and staff, and a new color for Lupin's trademark jacket. And I get that the jacket might seem like an odd thing to focus on, but among Lupin fans it's become something of a symbol of the different evolutions of the character, giving fans a visual shorthand for exactly what sort of Lupin story you'll be getting. You might not be someone who follows the series too closely, but just by looking at the color of his jacket, you can generally tell what sort of story you're going to be in for. With the green jacket of Part 1 representing a simpler, more carefree Lupin, Part 2's red jacket ramping up the spectacle and absurdity of it all, Part 3's pink jacket featuring much more of a focus on goofy, cartoony stories, and blue jacket representing the Lupin of the modern age, with much more of an emphasis on complicated, grounded narratives than any of its predecessors. So while at its heart Lupin is always Lupin, if there's a specific type of story you want from it, then you need only look at the jacket color to narrow it down. If you want a nice crime adventure spectacle story, then watch anything with red jacket. If you want something a bit more nonsensical and silly, then find yourself a pink jacket episode. Or hell, if you want something that's like a gritty reimagining of the series, then just watch A Woman Called Fujiko, because that's also a thing, and it's honestly pretty good. Whatever kind of story you may want, Lupin has probably not only done it, but has a jacket color dedicated to it. So, if I've done my job in this video, you're probably at least a little curious about where to start. And well, to that I'd say you could start Lupin literally anywhere and not miss anything. But if that seems a bit daunting, I can at least give you some personal suggestions. Lupin Part 2 might be seen as a bit dated now, seeing how it's about 40 years old, but it's still a lot of fun and was what defined the franchise. So I'd definitely consider it one of the better places to start, and it was also the version of the show I grew up watching, so admittedly I'm a little biased there. If you want a more modern spin on the franchise, then Part 5 just came out last year, and is honestly probably my favorite part yet. Featuring some of the best stories the series has ever told, as well as tons of love and reverence to everything that came before it, as well as some downright insane revelations that turn everything we know about Lupin on its head. Though, if a full show sounds like it might be too much for you and you want something a bit more digestible, then may I recommend the film Lupin III Castle of Cagliostro. It's a bit more family-friendly than what you're generally going to get out of Lupin, but it's the directorial debut of Hayao Miyazaki, and he honestly hit it out of the park. To date, I still think this is probably his most underrated movie, and just more people need to talk about this one. Regardless of what you end up watching though, if you end up liking it, there's plenty more out there just waiting to be uncovered. Lupin's in something of a renaissance right now, so it's a perfect chance for anyone to get on board. The last few TV specials have all been pretty incredible, and I already mentioned how good Part 5 is. But even beyond that, they recently announced a new Black Jacket anime is already on the way. And while researching this video, a trailer dropped for a brand new Lupin movie, and just holy shit, look at it. So right now the future's looking really bright for everyone's favorite monkey-faced thief, and I for one am all kinds of excited to see what comes next. Because, despite whatever flaws it might have, I can count on Lupin for the sort of fun I don't get from a lot of shows nowadays. It's a classic that walks the fine line between the humane and the absurd, filled to the brim with stories that'll put a big dumb smile on your face or even leave you on the edge of your seat. And I just love that, because that's just the fun of it.